For better or worse, the Winnipeg Jets are treating free agency like business as usual. Is it really? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, Winnipeg Jets fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Pearson, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for choosing to make Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, day one of free agency is through, and the Jets really didn't do much. In fact, you could argue that Winnipeg, by not doing much, arguably made the best choice. But when the Jets are in a situation where free agency really isn't business as usual, especially for the Jets, did Winnipeg win out, or was this a bigger mistake than we might realize? With that in mind, obviously, let's dive into what has been a eventful, I would say, 24 hours to start. So Winnipeg kind of came into free agency with the idea that, their biggest free agent addition was probably already made. Jonathan Toews was going to be one of their marquee signings. And I think that they've telegraphed that for, a few weeks now. The Jets, when it comes to free agency, UFA stuff is really not what they do. And when they don't do that, usually that's a smart decision. You do not build successful teams out of free agency. It just doesn't really happen. Teams can certainly add on top of their already good foundation through free agency, and I think that there are instances where that does happen, but usually when you sign a UFA, especially, in a scenario where perhaps you're kind of in a little bit of a buyer's market, suddenly it just seems like you run the risk of overpaying, and with all of these teams now looking at a cap that's going up, there were plenty of risks and opportunities for teams to massively overpay and make some really bad signings. The Jets really didn't do that. Winnipeg took a much more modest approach, and their signings outside of Toews included Tanner Pearson, Koepke, Phil Giuseppe, and rumored to be Kale Clague as well. So half of these signings are just straight up moose depth. Giuseppe and Clague are going to support Manitoba. Tanner Pearson and Koepke, though, those guys are likely to be NHLers for the Jets. And when we see that Winnipeg usually likes to keep salary, especially of the $1 million kind, up with the Jets, you kind of get the sense that both Pearson and Koepke are intended to actually help out Winnipeg's upcoming season. I've seen some people push back on this and suggest that, not really either of these guys may actually be full-time Jets by the end of camp and preseason next year. I can assure you that's not going to be the case. They will be playing, whether it's a lot or somewhat, but at least a handful of NHL games. These guys are intended to be staying up with a big club, and I would be very surprised if a younger player or something supplants them. It just doesn't really happen. It's not Winnipeg's way, and I think that that's been true for a long time. So with this kind of stuff, I just generally felt relatively apathetic about it. It's one thing when you don't really make big moves, right? I don't necessarily mind not making big moves in free agency, but I think when you see all these teams needing to offload some real talent and Winnipeg generally not being linked to much of anything, not even offer sheets, we're not hearing them linked to trades, and all of these other teams are aggressively making moves, it does make me wonder if the Jets are, again, too complacent. We've seen this on and off over the years where they'll have, a good season and then they go into the offseason and just sort of run it back. And I kind of feel like that's Winnipeg's plan again. The problem for the Jets is that they're about to lose one of their biggest 5v4 pieces and a guy who brings some of their higher end creativity. He's going to go to another team. He's probably going to get a top line deployment. And I think a lot of Jets fans are going to find out that Nick Ehlers was actually a lot bigger and a much better player than they realize. The Jets have unfortunately put themselves in a position where, they're not going to be able to make that happen. It's really just a matter of time for him to sign elsewhere. And unfortunately for us, that kind of means that the Jets already needed to make a replacement. But Brock Besser has extended with Vancouver. Andrew Mangiapane is signing with the Edmonton Oilers, which just broke now. And so suddenly Winnipeg doesn't really have replacement options. Pearson and Koepke are you know, they're your reinforcements. Unless the Jets make a trade, it just seems like Winnipeg is content to sort of not really make big splashes and make Taves your big acquisition, which I've said it before. I just don't think that this is the right plan. You had a really successful President's Trophy season, and people will say, well, obviously, they don't need to run it back or they don't need to change it and they could just run it back and they'll be fine. But we all know that that's not really true. It's never been true with this team as much as we pretend that it is. During the regular season, it's not going to be a problem. But during the playoffs is where, the Jets roster quality starts to really show up. In those moments where you need that extra bit of juice, those moments that can really decide your fate in close margins, the Jets are well built with a strong foundation, but they don't have the scoring punch in a couple of lower spots to where it can really get you in that final hurdle. So I don't know. Winnipeg just sort of seemingly is doing their usual coast along. And look, the positive spin, they didn't overcommit to anyone. These deals that they're signing are cheap, right? $1 million or less for one season, no big deal. I guess where I just feel a bit disappointed, and it is still the first day, but I just think Winnipeg is not really recognizing the moment. And they've had this happen before where certainly they've made some moves, they've added some talent, but it's not really the kind of guys that move the needle. And if the Jets actually want to win the cup, that's where you really need to start getting aggressive. But I think the folks who are in the comments often being skeptical about the Jets doing anything in this offseason, right now you're winning out. I've tried to generally push my skepticism to the side, but I think we're seeing one of those famous Jets off seasons where they don't do a lot. They make one or two splashes and then they sort of call it a day. And in some ways there's merit to doing that, but I think that's when you're a better team than the Jets are. Winnipeg honestly needs a lot. And I think if they don't start really making some big trade acquisitions this coming summer and for the next couple of weeks, what they bring into camp this coming fall, I don't think is going to be good enough to get them deep in the postseason. This team this past season got about as far as I think anyone really expected them to. They had some really close games against the Stars, but I think you saw those margins not really sit in Winnipeg's favor. And then watching Dallas then get beat to absolute crap against, Edmonton just makes you wonder how far or how close really were the Jets last season. And the reality is probably not that close. So really tough one. I know that the Jets have some unique recruitment challenges, and that's why they don't tend to build in free agency. But I think Winnipeg is going to have to start really being proactive and doing something to help improve this roster quality. If the Jets kind of roll back with what they had last year, first off, you're probably not going to win the President's Trophy. That rely on a lot of guys having career years, and your roster is just not going to be as good as it was this past season. So a lot of big moving parts. I will say that there is one avenue that I want to talk about because the Jets could go through the offer sheet. Are there good offer sheet targets left? Who could Winnipeg potentially go after and try and force a move if they're not really open to doing big free agent signings? We'll chat about that in just a moment. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every moment more and even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling for yourself? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Now, FanDuel helps you track all sorts of action, whether it's before or even during the game. If you're watching who's making the right passes, who's scoring those important goals, who might even be assisting some of your favorite moments, this is the way to capitalize. And if you think you know who's going to win big, you can even combine bets for a same game parlay to capitalize on your victory streak. Now, if you are new to FanDuel, there's an even better option. New customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. So open the FanDuel app today or visit fanduel.com to get started. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us at tonight's show as we are chatting a little bit about the Jets not really doing a lot in free agency. I think that was kind of my expectation going into this, but I thought outside of free agency, the Jets would really get aggressive, maybe in the trade market, maybe trying to do something creative, maybe even doing an offer sheet. We've heard teams being linked to potential offer sheets for guys like Keandre Miller. We've heard some rumors about maybe guys thinking about Maverick Bork, but obviously for different reasons, both of those players are not being targeted now. Maverick Bork is staying with Dallas. Keandre just got traded to Carolina and signed a huge extension, so that appears to be off the table. But there are still some guys out there that teams could offer sheet, and maybe one or two might be worth it for the Jets to go after. If I'm looking at major offer sheet targets that I think would be in Winnipeg's price bracket, you might want to go after a Mason McTavish, especially if you want to offer him a higher salary. The Jets can't really do the mid-tier because they don't have their second, so you're either going really cheap or you're going on the higher end. And with McTavish, you're looking at the first and third range, right? I don't think the Jets can afford to do a small salary. And so, this is going to be one of those interesting things where I think McTavish would easily get matched. I don't think the Ducks are intent on letting him go. And so in terms of what you could potentially do with that, maybe rather than, actually going through with an offer sheet, you sort of tease that you might do it, but maybe you actually make this your trade target. McTavish is a good center. He's young. He's skilled. He had a little bit of a down season this past year, but I am pretty bullish on him. I think he'll do really well outside of Anaheim. Anaheim may also think that he's a bigger part of their future than it seems right now. So I doubt that they're really intent on letting him go. I would be very shocked if anyone actually pries him out of Anaheim. I would think the Ducks want to keep him. Elsewhere, I guess the Jets could maybe do a cheaper thing. Maybe they offer sheet a Cody Glass or something. I don't really know why you would do that. Glass is one of those players where maybe you send a lower round pick or something. I mean, New Jersey seems to have been a little bit surprised by the amount of interest in him. He's a really competent middle six center and a guy that has a little bit of untapped potential. I wouldn't say that I'm really expecting a lot of upside with him, but he's got good defensive results. He's got hands that are not made of stone. And I think Glass legitimately brings a solid two-way presence. Because of the reported interest, they ended up qualifying him. So that's less convenient, but I do think the Jets could get him out from New Jersey for a cheap deal. I don't think you'd really need to go the offer sheet route. And if you do, I don't really understand the benefit of doing so. It's not like the Devils are particularly cap strapped. And I mean, they could probably easily match a cheap deal. So rather than that, you probably just go with a trade. In terms of where I do worry about offer sheets, it's actually not who Winnipeg would target, but teams targeting the Jets. Winnipeg has three RFAs that are up for extension that are probably more notable. The first being Gabriel Vilardi. Vilardi, we haven't really heard a lot about being given, a major deal. We did hear that the negotiations were in process for a contract extension. And because UFA was so thin this year, I think we're going to see something with this offer sheet market. I know that usually feels a little overstated. And more often than not, the folks that say nothing ever happens end up being right. But this doesn't feel like, business as usual. If Vilardi does get targeted by an offer sheet, I'm curious to know what the Jets do here. Do you take the package and compensation if it's reasonable enough for Vilardi? Do you let him go? I don't know. With him, he's had some real rough injuries over the years, and it's partly stunted his career. I think, from my take, the Jets, if it's under 7, they would probably match it. But if it starts to push into really high salary ranges, I wonder if they rethink that. The Jets don't really want to break their wage structure on a guy who's good, but maybe not exceptional. And that could be an interesting thing where somebody tries to force a Velarde move. So keep an eye out on that one. I tend to lean towards the thought it's not going to happen. And if an offer sheet does happen, the Jets will probably match it. I just don't think that this is like a super legitimate target. But if a team is really trying to force this move to happen, and they didn't really get what they wanted in free agency, or trades aren't opening up, this could be an interesting avenue. Winnipeg doesn't usually have this happen to them, and they've not really done offer sheets to other teams. So I'm not really led to believe that this is going to happen. But this, again, feels like a very unpredictable market. UFA kind of sucked right now. And so teams are legitimately looking for ways to try and get talent somewhere, right? And if you can't get it from UFA or out of trades, maybe you force this move through an offer sheet. Dylan Sandberg is also eligible for this. I don't really worry about a Sandberg offer sheet. Honestly, I feel like Sandberg is very committed to the Jets. I'd be shocked if he would even really entertain any of this. And so I think Winnipeg is probably, more than comfortable signing him long term. I think the big question with Sandberg is just how long that contract is going to be, and for how much, right? I think he could now push into the $6 million range, which I know a lot of people, or at least one or two a couple months ago, thought I was crazy for suggesting that. I said it maybe a year ago now, and as it turns out, that ended up being, almost dead on the money. He is probably going to get a pretty hefty pay raise, more than people thought. So Sandberg, he's a good player. I think he's one of our most important guys, and getting him locked up long term would be fantastic. Eligible for an offer sheet, don't think it's going to happen. But again, maybe a team does something really crazy to try and force Winnipeg's hand. The last guy that could be targeted, it's Morgan Barron. Now, I don't know why, again, a team would do this. It's not like Barron is kind of in that Holloway tier of being good enough to where you project him to be a big scorer. And, if you give him a really increased role, you think you're going to get a big return. Barron's not really that tier of guy. But, you've got another RFA. If you give him a lower tier a lower tier offer sheet, you're not going to have to give up much. And, the Jets would probably not feel super, super inclined to match it. I don't think that they want to pay more than like $2 million for this guy. And I think if you start to push beyond that, I mean, at that point, like, what's the real, draw here? Barron's a solid fourth liner, and that's kind of it. So, for the Jets, um, again, do they really run the risk of guys like Barron and Sandberg getting targeted? Probably not. But I do think Velarde is more the prime target I would be concerned about. And if the Jets try to go for somebody else with an offer sheet, good luck to them. I mean, they don't really have a ton of assets to make this happen. Not having your second really makes that road very difficult. And so my feeling is the Jets would look at some of these RFAs and would probably prefer to do a bigger trade, right? You maybe tease out that you'd be thinking about an offer sheet, and then you ask to negotiate trade terms. But with RFAs, those guys are going to have the final say on whether they'd sign and extend with that team. And the Jets are going to be on a lot of lists that's probably not as favorable. So keep an eye out for this. But I think tomorrow is going to be very interesting. I'm going to keep an eye out on any offer sheets that happen. Hopefully something happens, because I feel like this free agency has not really been that exciting. More just watching a couple of teams really crash and burn. And as far as the Jets are concerned, at least if nothing else, they haven't put themselves behind the eight ball with a really disastrous extension or a major, major contract that's going to be an anchor in a couple of years. I think we did kind of dodge a bullet with Besser. So as much as I like Brock, I don't really like the idea of paying him, $7+ million over 7+ years for, what is this essentially kind of Kyle Connor, but slower. And I would say Kyle Connor of the previous years, not this past season. If you know what I mean, you understand what I'm saying about Besser. Solid player, not a great fit. So with all that in mind, the Jets have a couple of orders of business to take care of. And I guess the biggest question is, you didn't really have a big free agency. You're probably not going to have a big one. You probably aren't doing any major offer sheets that we can tell. what's left for the Jets to really do? What is their plan going forward? Because they've got to replace Ehlers somehow, and it just doesn't seem like that is registering as much as I think, it'd be helpful for the Jets fan base to feel, right? I think we're all kind of on edge. We're all sort of waiting for the shoe to drop, and it just doesn't seem like the Jets are being linked to much. So we'll chat about that coming right up. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us to tonight's show as we are just closing out with some thoughts on what the Jets can even do at this point. Obviously, Winnipeg hasn't really been linked to a ton. Things are fairly quiet at the moment, and in terms of trade rumors, we haven't heard the Jets linked to anything. We haven't really seen them being suggested as willing to offer, a major offer sheet to a big player. None of that, right? That doesn't mean that the Jets are not going to do anything, though. So Winnipeg does have options, and I honestly feel like, there's going to at least be some kind of a trade. The Jets are not going to go into the season not having some sort of an Ehlers replacement. As much as, I may be not thrilled with some of their free agency moves, I do think that they're aware that Ehlers is probably a bigger need to replace than, anything else at this point. But their options to swap him out for somebody, relevant and good have started to narrow very quickly. Mangiapane would have been a guy that I would have looked at for a value-based contract, but he's gone to the Oilers. I don't think the Jets were really that interested in him other than just sort of keeping tabs. Alex Tuch is apparently being extended by the Sabres, if rumors are to be believed. So that kind of takes him off. That kind of leaves not many teams that have something of interest. Maybe you go to Seattle and see if they'd be willing to move McCann and if he'd be willing to waive. But the Kraken appear to be massing, lots of players to try and do something. I think that they think that they're competitive. So I doubt that they're looking to really move anyone, which kind of makes sense, I guess. The Pacific is not exactly a juggernaut, but I don't know. Looking at that Kraken roster, I can't really see them being competitive. That kind of leaves not many teams that would actually be willing to sell. And Pittsburgh has made it very known that they are open for business. So if that is Winnipeg's first port of call, this could be where the Jets actually make some sort of hay, if you will. Rickard Rakell, Brian Rust, maybe Tommy Novak, these guys might all be available. The Penguins have said that they are willing to do some deals, willing to sell some players. I'm not going to talk about Crosby or Malkin because that's just not realistic, right? But the rest of these guys could be conceivably available. Now, I do like Rust, but I think for Brian at this stage of his career, he's like 33. His decline has kind of been a little bit noticeable. I do still think that he's a very good player, but I would not be trading the farm for him. Rickard Rakell's kind of in a similar spot, but with Rakell, he's been really resurgent. He plays center, and I think that that's going to put a premium on whoever tries to bring him in. Now, he also is signed for a couple more years at a very reasonable $5 million cap hit. I think my caution with both Rust and Rakell is that they're 32 and 33, and while I think that they do have some serviceable years left, I just don't know what the next couple of seasons really look like. And I don't think you want to pay a ton of assets trying to bring one of these guys in only to find out that their flash-in-the-pan performance, more in Rakell's case than anything, just doesn't really translate to Winnipeg. Rust has a longer track record of recent success, and I think he's probably one of my favorite underappreciated players. I just don't think that he's likely to get moved at present unless some team really makes a big offer. I'm a little more intrigued by Tommy Novak, though. Novak hasn't really been talked about as being on the block so much, but, he's got another year of control after this following season. He's at a $3.5 million cap hit. He's a very quality middle six center. And while he doesn't replace Ehlers, he'd help Winnipeg's center depth, especially with the reality that, Taves is probably not going to be a great 2C. You've only got Nemesnikov and Gustafsson, Barron, and maybe Lowry. And Lowry's likely to miss part of the season to start. honestly, I don't even know what he's going to be like when he comes back, because the surgery that he's getting is apparently to correct an issue he's had for a few years. That does not sound minor. That really doesn't. So the Jets kind of need to acquire a bunch of different pieces. Maybe you try and do something here with the Penguins that's a little on the bigger side. Maybe you try and make a multi-part deal. I don't really know how this would all translate and how the Jets would be able to swing this, but if Winnipeg is really trying to save up for a big swing with maybe a one-stop shop destination, Pittsburgh's probably one of the teams that you'd be calling. You've got lots of futures. You've got a fair few decent draft picks. You don't really seem to have a direction for Brad Lambert right now, and maybe Lambert in Pittsburgh, after you've already traded Rucker there, would be, in a good environment. The Pens are a young team in terms of some of the prospect pools. They need to kind of gut some of their veterans who are over 30 and replace them with some younger talent. They're kind of past that stage of competitiveness. They've been uncompetitive for a while now. It's time to start, retooling and rebuilding. And the Jets might be able to offer some really good kind of volume aspects for decent players that could help the Jets right now. I think the Penguins are probably one of the best trade partners I can imagine. There are some other teams that Winnipeg could go to, but it doesn't seem like many teams are really open for business when it comes to selling. The only other areas you might think about are like the Tampa Bay Lightning or Florida Panthers. They've got to cut some salary. So if it's the Lightning, maybe you trade for Oliver Bjorkstrand or something and take him off their hands. If you can get them to maybe swap a higher pick for one of your lower ones, that's great. Or if you go to the Panthers, maybe Evan Rodriguez is your target. Erod would be great for the Jets. I think that he's a very solid middle sixer. Again, he's not going to be, the replacement for Ehlers that maybe you'd love, but I think he would do a very good job for what the Jets need. And that's probably about as much as you can ask. I'm not looking for a one-to-one, but I think if you can help to plug in at least some of the gaps and try and give yourself more of a fighting chance without spending, $6 billion assets for something, this could be a great chance. And these teams that need to cut salary, this is where you could make a play. We already know that the Lightning are apparently trying to go after Ehlers themselves, so they could really use the cap help, and that might be a mutually beneficial thing for the Jets. So lots of moving parts here. I have the gut feeling that we're going to see at least some sort of a cap dump sent to the Jets. I don't think that they're going to do much else, but maybe there's a big surprise. I'd be curious to know how you're feeling about all of this. Are you happy with how the Jets have done free agency? Are you disappointed? Are you hoping that we get linked to a trade? Drop your thoughts and feelings so far in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.